Welcome to the programme. Dr. Kaul, does this really make very much economic difference either to Britain or to China?
Thanks. Yes, it certainly would do in the longer run. In fact, just as you just mentioned, there are 40 billion worth of deals that have been signed, and the UK would be very keen to project this as something that would shore up jobs in industries that have recently been forced to lay off a lot of the workers. It would also, I think, cement the economic relations between these two countries, which have a growing and a large volume of trade. But more specifically, they've also set up a lot of financial deals, and UK has now become the first Western country that's going to issue sovereign bonds that would be denominated in renminbi, the Chinese currency. So, in terms of practical financial implications, there are a lot of advantages for both sides. But perhaps more for the UK in immediate and visible terms. For China, of course, it's a demonstration effect in that it brings China to a geopolitical parity with countries like the US.
So it sounded there as if yet again it's the kind of British financial sector that might come out of this with the cherry. Is there going to be a little metal bashing and a lot of financial speculation?
The British financial sector has definitely come out of this well, but then the question is that we are a long way from the ethical foreign policy of, once upon a time that the UK had. So it's quite clear that this government is keen to promote the business relations, and it succeeded in doing that with signing on these deals with China. It remains to be seen, however, what the longer term implications would be in terms of the battering that UK's image in terms of democracy as a defender of democracy and human rights might be taken. That in effect to any people who are resisting and fighting for democracy or freedom in China, this just puts spade to the whole idea of the West actually having any concern for human rights, given the way in which the dissenters were used for repression, not just in China but also in the UK. So it's definitely a fork in the road, and it's a curious bringing together of a communist economic giant, the capitalist supplicant at this point, it seems. The other, I think, interesting thing is that the President Xi Jinping has today said that he hopes that the UK would stay in the EU, and that has an interesting implication for those within the Conservative Party who think that a stronger bilateral relationship with China would have been one of the reasons why the UK need not stay in the EU or have closer ties with the EU. The Chinese president has said that, in his view, the UK should stay in the EU. So that's an interesting twist, I thought.
Yeah, I'll come back to the question of the human rights record in a moment, but I just wanted to get some sense of what you thought the impact of the Chinese investment might be on the British economy. For instance, is it, with the talk of it being important that Britain's in the EU, with the talk of the financial deal that you mentioned, that what many economists regard as the kind of malformed structure of the British economy, very dependent on finance, very kind of internationally open and deregulated to international markets, and therefore the easiest gateway to the EU for non-EU countries. Is it going to reinforce that profile of the British economy, or will it do something to address the sort of chronic underinvestment in manufacturing that many people point to?
Well, you see, at this point, given the economic and political policies that the government here, the Tories, have pursued, it's unlikely that it's really not a no-brainer, because the Tories are not going to be this party is not going to be investing a lot in the industries that need that investment, and the infrastructure is fairly outdated, as a lot of commentators recognize. So it is important to get that kind of injection of capital from somewhere, and at this point, it seems China seems to be able to do that, and that's part of the whole Chinese strategy of doing that, not just in the UK but across large parts of the world, as a way of securing its influence and shoring up both with its own domestic policy and also making sure that their own economy is not going to have is going to have a stronger basis by these international linkages. The problem, I suppose, in the medium term would be that with these investments in these sectors in the UK, with that much Chinese investment, one of the problems is going to be obviously the fact that, in terms of in regulations, I mean, would we now be seeing in fact, a Chinese way of running these businesses where the regulations are not treated with the same amount of seriousness that they should be? What about the way in which the workers would be treated, the environmental regulations? So all of those questions will arise, I think, as we go along, because right now it seems like a win-win situation where the UK can say, okay, China can be investing money in these sectors, but in the longer run, what are the implications? What are going to be the implications of that for those specific industries? There is there is obviously this whole debate about whether the nuclear sector is actually a sector that we should be going for, that we should be investing in, as opposed to other sources of renewable energy. So it's deciding. I mean, the current government's approach is actually putting us on a path that could, in the near term, in the near to medium term, lead to a lot of complications. At this point, of course, all of that is not very visible because we're just looking at the financial deals. There are these estimates of these homes that would be created, the jobs that would be created, but we don't know what kind of jobs these are going to be. We don't know how dependent and how vulnerable all of that is going to be, depending on what happens to the Chinese economy. And as we've seen in the last few months, that it's far from clear that the Chinese economy can just go on, producing these miraculous rates of growth. It's slowing down. It's got its own problems with deflation. It's got its own problems with domestic consumption. So it remains to be seen what will actually come of it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the nuclear deal that you mentioned, that the Chinese state-run economy is going to be owning a chunk of the nuclear power industry in this country. There was a comment piece in The Guardian this week that said that David Cameron doesn't seem to have a problem with nationalisation as long as it's French energy companies owning British energy companies, as long as it's the Chinese owning the nuclear power system. He's just got a problem with the British state nationalising things. Do you think they're in some sort of ideological trouble, the Tories, over all this?
Well, that's certainly the case. The way in which the word nation is employed, for example, when we look at nationalism, which is what the government would of course seek to promote, versus nationalization, you can see the duplicity in that entire narrative. That in the name of the nation, we can get together as a people, but in the name of the nation, if we have industries that have actually a record of working well under nationalized or sort of that kind of state-owned sort of systems, then the government doesn't want. But I mean, it's fairly ironic. I mean, the idea that here our position is that we don't want state ownership. We don't, because that's not what we believe in. And yet we are being forced to have these deals with a country that has reached where it has reached today by having precisely those kinds of economic structures, by precisely having the state invest, the state own these key industries. And so it's ironic that what we think is not good for us is something that we see as being a success elsewhere, and we're quite happy to sort of try to hang on to that success by having these deals with China.
Well, talking of things that are good for us but not perhaps seen as good for other people, what about the question of human rights? Is there a longer-term cost about saying, basically, look, we don't care how your government treats the Uyghur people, we don't care about factory conditions in China, we don't care about civil rights and what happens to dissidents in China? Do you think there is a tangible cost over the long term to taking that kind of realpolitik attitude?
Absolutely. This is something that it beggars belief how the present government here doesn't see a problem with going along with China to the extent that they are willing to emulate the manner of suppression of dissent in China on issues like, for example, Tibet. I mean, we should remember that earlier this year, the UK was rebuffed by China in the context of Hong Kong when during the pro-democracy demonstrations, China did not allow the Common Select Committee from the UK to go and visit. So as well as the fact that any mention of Tibet, including by a scholar, Xiao Jiang, who was whose house was raided today, and all he was doing was conducting a non-violent protest on the street. So these are, in living in a democracy as we do, the implication for us to be acting as if we were sort of the mouthpiece of the Chinese media is fairly serious. And in the longer term, we could be losing whatever remains of our reputation as upholders of these values of human rights, because this is not just with China. In 3 weeks, the Indian Prime Minister is going to be visiting here. So are we now going to have relations with all of these countries and all of these leaders and not allow dissent, that do not allow dissent within their own countries, but then we will not allow people to raise these questions in the UK as well? And that is really problematic in the longer term for international reasons, but also for domestic reasons, because that sends a very strong signal to the public here as well about what our government thinks of as being okay and what it thinks of as being not okay, which is protesting in a democracy, even if it's a non-violent protest, but on issues that are significant, such as, for example, the issues of human rights, self-determination, or other kinds of minority suppression that go on in large parts of the world. For China, it's a win-win situation where, for the Chinese leadership, it's a demonstration effect. What better illustration could they have had, for their own consuming mainstream public back at home of their success, of the success of the fact that it doesn't really matter how people are treated, with what seriousness human rights are taken, as long as we can have, these investment deals with countries overseas, including countries in such as the UK, which have a claim to a certain tradition of democracy and human rights.
Okay.